When retired Marine Marcus Thompson bought the abandoned riverside fire station for $35,000, he thought he was purchasing a chance at peace. What he discovered buried beneath decades of ash and silence would shatter that hope forever. The conspiracy his German shepherd Diesel uncovered wasn't just hidden in the past. It was still breathing, still watching, and still killing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The medication bottles lined the kitchen counter like tiny plastic soldiers, each one bearing witness to the war still raging inside Marcus Thompson's mind. Sertraline for the depression that crept in with the morning light. Prazosin for the nightmares that turned sleep into another battlefield. Propranolol for the panic attacks that ambushed him in grocery store checkout lines when someone dropped a can behind him. At 34, he had collected more prescriptions than most people twice his age, each one a small surrender to an enemy he could not see, could not fight, could not defeat. The apartment in downtown Portland pressed around him like a concrete tomb, its walls thin enough that every siren, every car backfire, every raised voice from the neighboring units sent electricity shooting through his nervous system. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, leading a squad through the deadliest valleys in Helmand Province, and now he flinched at the sound of a coffee pot gurgling to life. The irony was not lost on him, though it offered no comfort. Marcus stood at the narrow window of his 4th-floor unit, watching the morning commute unfold below. The city moved with the frantic energy of an anthill kicked by a careless boot. Horns blared in endless succession, pedestrians darted between cars, and somewhere in the distance, an ambulance wailed its urgent song. Each sound layered upon the next, until they became an assault on his already frayed nerves. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, trying to ground himself in something real, something solid. His reflection stared back at him, a ghost of the man who had once commanded respect on the battlefield. His brown hair, once kept in a regulation high and tight, had grown out into an unruly mess that he rarely bothered to comb. Dark circles ringed his green eyes, the result of too many sleepless nights spent pacing the apartment or staring at the ceiling, afraid to close his eyes and face whatever horrors waited in his dreams. He had lost 20 pounds since his discharge, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been solid muscle and unwavering determination. A soft whine drew his attention away from the window. Diesel, his 5-year-old German shepherd, sat by the front door with his leash in his mouth, amber eyes fixed on Marcus with the patient persistence that only dogs possessed. The animal had been his partner during his final deployment, trained in explosive detection and force protection. When Marcus left the service, he had been allowed to adopt Diesel through a military working dog retirement program. It was the only good thing to come out of his discharge papers. Diesel was a magnificent animal, his coat a rich blend of black and tan that caught the light streaming through the apartment's single window. His ears stood at attention, always listening, always alert. Despite being officially retired from military service, he maintained the discipline and bearing of a soldier. He never begged for food, never chewed furniture, never barked without cause. But in the cramped confines of the apartment, Marcus could see the restlessness building in the dog's posture, the way his tail rarely wagged, the way he spent hours staring out the window at a world he was no longer allowed to patrol. They were both prisoners here, Marcus realized. 2 warriors trying to exist in a world that had no use for their particular skills, no understanding of the bonds forged in combat, no patience for the invisible wounds they carried. The city demanded conformity, routine, the ability to pretend that the worst thing that might happen on any given day was a traffic jam or a delayed coffee order. For men who had lived with the constant possibility of death, who had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box, civilian life felt like wearing a costume that never quite fit. The knock on his door came at exactly 9:30, the same time every Tuesday morning. Chen from down the hall, an elderly woman who had appointed herself the building's unofficial social coordinator, stood in the hallway holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a smile that Marcus found both kind and exhausting. She meant well, he knew that, but her attempts at conversation felt like navigating a minefield. How was he feeling today? Had he been sleeping better? Maybe he should get out more, meet some nice people, find a hobby. Each question was a probe into wounds that had not yet healed, might never heal. Marcus accepted the cookies with a polite thank you and endured 5 minutes of small talk about the weather, the building's new mailboxes, and her grandson's soccer team. When she finally left, he set the plate on his kitchen counter next to the pill bottles and slumped into his worn armchair. Diesel padded over and rested his massive head on Marcus's knee, his eyes reflecting an understanding that no human had managed to offer. The dog had been there in the dust and heat of Afghanistan. He had smelled the cordite and heard the explosions. He knew what the darkness looked like. The envelope arrived later that morning, slipped under his door while he was in the shower. Marcus found it when he emerged from the bathroom, his hair still dripping, wearing the same grey sweatpants and faded Marine Corps t-shirt that had become his uniform of civilian defeat. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with his name written in precise block letters across the front. No return address, no postmark that he could make out. His first instinct was suspicion, a soldier's paranoia that had served him well overseas but felt ridiculous in a Portland apartment building. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the letterhead of Patterson and Associates, Legal Services, located in Salem, Oregon. The letter was formal, businesslike, and completely bewildering. It informed him that he had been named as the sole beneficiary in the will of one Robert Bobby Martinez, and that he was requested to appear at their offices at his earliest convenience to discuss the details of his inheritance. The name Bobby Martinez struck him like a physical blow, dredging up memories he had spent 2 years trying to bury. Bobby had been his radio operator during his second deployment, a kid from East Los Angeles with a quick smile and an even quicker wit. He had been 22 years old when the improvised explosive device tore through their convoy outside of Marja, taking him instantly along with 2 other Marines whose faces Marcus still saw in his dreams. Marcus had carried Bobby's body back to base, had written the letter to his family, had spoken at the memorial service about courage and sacrifice and honor. He had not spoken to anyone from Bobby's family since. The letter provided no explanation for how or why Bobby's father had chosen to leave him anything, no context for this unexpected connection to a past he was trying to forget. It simply stated that Mr. Martinez had passed away 3 months prior, and that the terms of his will were quite specific regarding Marcus's inheritance. A phone number was provided for scheduling an appointment. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last. He spent the rest of the day in a state of restless agitation, pacing the small apartment, while Diesel watched with growing concern. The dog could sense his distress, could read the subtle changes in posture and breathing that indicated rising anxiety. By evening, Diesel had positioned himself between Marcus and the front door, his body language suggesting that he would not allow his human to do anything reckless without at least attempting to intervene. The drive to Salem took 2 hours through Oregon countryside that gradually shifted from urban sprawl to rolling farmland dotted with vineyards and small towns that looked like they had been frozen in time sometime around 1985. Marcus drove his battered Honda Civic with the windows down, trying to clear his head in the clean air that smelled of hay and distant wood smoke. Diesel rode in the passenger seat with his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind, looking more content than Marcus had seen him in months. Patterson and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Salem's main street, above a used bookstore and next to a coffee shop that served pastries from behind glass cases that had seen better decades. The law office itself was a study in faded respectability, with dark wood paneling, hunting prints on the walls, and carpet that had probably been luxurious when installed sometime during the Reagan administration. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted him with the sort of gentle professionalism reserved for people dealing with death and its complicated aftermath. Thomas Patterson proved to be a man in his late 60s, tall and thin with silver hair that had receded to reveal a high, intelligent forehead. His office was lined with law books that looked well used rather than decorative, and his desk was covered with the organized chaos of an active practice. He shook Marcus's hand with the firm grip of someone who understood that small gestures mattered when dealing with grief and confusion. The attorney settled behind his desk and opened a thick file that bore Marcus's name on the tab. He began by expressing his condolences for the loss of Bobby Martinez, even though Marcus had not seen the young Marine's family since the funeral. Then he explained, in careful, precise language, that Bobby's father, Roberto, had followed his son's military career through letters and news reports, that he had specifically requested information about the Marines who had served with Bobby, and that he had been particularly interested in the man who had carried his son home. Roberto Martinez had worked for 37 years as a firefighter in Riverside, California, eventually rising to the rank of captain before retiring on full pension. He had never married after his wife died in childbirth, had raised Bobby alone, had poured all of his love and hopes into a son who would never come home. When Bobby died, something had broken inside the older man, but instead of turning bitter, he had channeled his grief into a mission of helping other veterans struggling with the transition back to civilian life. The inheritance was not money, Patterson explained, but property. Roberto Martinez had purchased the abandoned Riverside Fire Station No. 7 6 years earlier, when the city had closed it due to budget cuts. The building sat on 3 acres of land on the outskirts of town, far enough from the city center to provide privacy but close enough to maintain access to utilities and services. Roberto had intended to convert it into a retreat center for veterans, a place where they could find peace and purpose away from the chaos of modern life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His death from a sudden heart attack had ended those plans before they could begin. Now the property was Marcus's free and clear, along with a trust fund that would cover taxes and basic maintenance for the next 5 years. There were no conditions attached to the inheritance, no requirements that he continue Roberto's mission or honor the older man's memory in any specific way. It was, Patterson explained, a gift given freely by a father who had lost his son and wanted to help another father's son find his way home. Marcus sat in silence for a long time after the attorney finished speaking, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just been told. A stranger had left him a building, a piece of land, and enough money to maintain both for years to come. It made no sense, violated every principle of fairness and logic that he had learned in 34 years of life. But as he thought about his cramped apartment, his sleepless nights, the way Diesel's tail had barely wagged in 2 years of urban confinement, he felt something stir inside his chest that he had almost forgotten existed: hope. The drive to Riverside took another 4 hours, carrying him south through California's Central Valley as the sun climbed toward its peak. The landscape changed from Oregon's green hills to California's endless expanse of agricultural flatland, broken by small cities that existed primarily to serve the farming communities that surrounded them. Riverside proved to be one of these, a town of maybe 15,000 people spread across several square miles of former ranch land that had been subdivided into residential neighborhoods, strip malls, and the inevitable Walmart that anchored the commercial district. Fire Station No. 7 sat at the end of a dead-end street that had once been the town's main thoroughfare, but had been bypassed when the highway was rerouted in the 1990s. The building was a classic design from the 1950s, built of red brick with large bay doors that had once housed fire engines and emergency vehicles. A tall communications tower rose from one corner of the building, its purpose now obsolete in an age of cell phones and digital dispatch systems. The structure showed its age in the form of peeling paint on the trim, a few cracked windows, and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete apron where the trucks had once been parked. But the bones of the building were solid. Marcus could see that immediately. The brick walls were straight and true. The roof appeared intact despite its age, and the large windows would provide plenty of natural light once they were cleaned. The property was surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been installed to keep vandals and vagrants away during the building's years of abandonment. A large sign attached to the fence announced that the property was under private ownership and warned against trespassing, but someone had cut a hole in the fence near the main gate, suggesting that the warning had been only partially effective. Marcus parked his Honda outside the fence and walked the perimeter of the property with Diesel at his side. The dog was immediately alert, his nose working overtime as he catalogued the various scents that lingered around the abandoned building. For the first time in months, his tail showed signs of life, not quite wagging but no longer hanging limp with depression. This was a place with space to run, to explore, to remember what it felt like to have a job that mattered. The key to the main entrance had been included with the paperwork from Patterson's office, along with copies of the deed, tax records, and a brief history of the building compiled by the Riverside Historical Society. Fire Station No. 7 had been built in 1953 to serve the growing residential area on the town's west side. It had housed Engine 7 and Rescue 7, along with a crew of 12 full-time firefighters who had served the community for nearly 6 decades before budget cuts and consolidation had made the station redundant. The interior of the building opened up before Marcus like a cathedral dedicated to service and sacrifice. The main bay was a vast space with soaring ceilings supported by massive wooden beams. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and hydraulic fluid from the vehicles that had once been parked here, and the walls were lined with empty shelves that had once held equipment, tools, and supplies. At the far end of the bay, a staircase led to the second floor where the firefighters had once lived during their shifts. Light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the afternoon air. The space felt hollow but not empty, as if it were waiting for someone to fill it with purpose again. Marcus walked slowly through the bay, his footsteps echoing off the walls, while Diesel trotted ahead with his nose to the ground, following scent trails left by the small animals that had taken up residence during the building's abandonment. The second floor consisted of a series of smaller rooms that had once served as living quarters for the firefighters on duty. There was a kitchen with industrial appliances that had been built to feed a crew of hungry men after long hours fighting fires and responding to emergencies. A common room with large windows overlooking the bay below had served as a place for relaxation between calls. Individual sleeping quarters, each barely larger than a monk's cell, were lined up along a narrow corridor like rooms in a barracks. Everything was covered in a layer of dust and neglect, but Marcus could see past the surface decay to the potential that lay beneath. This had been a place where men lived and worked together in service to their community, where they had formed the kind of bonds that only came from shared danger and mutual dependence. It was not so different from the forward operating bases where he had lived in Afghanistan, places where strangers became brothers and where the mission always came before personal comfort or convenience. As he explored the upper floor, Marcus found himself imagining what it would be like to live here, to wake up in a place with space to breathe and room for Diesel to run. The thought of trading his cramped apartment for this echoing cathedral of service felt like the possibility of resurrection, of becoming human again instead of merely surviving from one day to the next. For the first time in 2 years, he could envision a future that did not consist solely of medication schedules and therapy appointments. The building's basement had served as storage for equipment and supplies, and it was here that Marcus began to understand the true scope of Roberto Martinez's vision. The space had been partially renovated, with new electrical wiring and plumbing roughed in but never completed. Architectural plans mounted on the walls showed how the basement could be converted into workshop space, meeting rooms, and additional living quarters. This had not been a casual retirement project for Roberto, but a serious attempt to create something meaningful from the ashes of his personal tragedy. In one corner of the basement, Marcus found a collection of boxes that had been carefully labeled and stored on metal shelving. The labels were written in the same precise block letters that had been on the envelope delivered to his apartment, and they contained what appeared to be research materials related to veteran services, psychological trauma, and therapeutic programs. Roberto Martinez had not simply decided to help veterans on a whim, but had studied the problem with the thoroughness of a career first responder, someone who understood that good intentions were not enough without proper planning and execution. One box contained correspondence with various veteran service organizations, letters from psychologists and social workers, and copies of grant applications for funding to support his planned retreat center. Another held architectural drawings and contractor estimates for the renovation work that had been started but never finished. A third contained personal letters from veterans who had heard about Roberto's project through informal networks, men and women who had written to express their support and their desperate need for exactly the kind of place he had envisioned creating. As Marcus read through some of these letters, he felt a growing sense of connection not just to Roberto Martinez but to a larger community of people who understood what he was going through. These were not abstract case studies or clinical descriptions but raw, honest accounts of the struggle to find meaning and purpose after military service. They spoke of nightmares and panic attacks, of marriages destroyed by invisible wounds, of the crushing loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who could never understand what it meant to serve in combat. The final box contained something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was a collection of newspaper clippings, military records, and personal photographs related to Bobby Martinez's service and death. Roberto had compiled a complete record of his son's military career, from his enlistment ceremony to his deployment photos to the official casualty report that had ended his young life. At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to Marcus, written in Roberto's careful handwriting and dated just 1 month before the older man's death. The letter was brief but profound, expressing Roberto's gratitude for the care Marcus had shown Bobby's body and memory, his understanding of the burden that surviving Marines carried, and his hope that the fire station might provide a place where Marcus could find peace and purpose. Roberto had never expected anything in return, had never intended to create an obligation or debt. He had simply recognized a fellow warrior in need of a mission and had provided the resources to make that mission possible. Standing in the basement of the abandoned fire station, holding a dead man's letter and surrounded by the evidence of dreams cut short by tragedy, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The constant tension that had been his companion since leaving the service began to ease, not disappearing but transforming into something that felt more like anticipation than dread. This was not just a building or a piece of property, but a chance to honor the memory of a young Marine who had died too soon, and an older man who had loved him enough to keep believing in hope even after hope seemed pointless. Diesel had followed him down to the basement and now sat beside him, his warm weight a comforting presence in the dusty gloom. The dog seemed to understand that this place was different, that it offered possibilities that their cramped apartment never could. His tail gave a tentative wag, the first genuine expression of happiness that Marcus had seen from him in months. They were both ready for something new, something that would allow them to be more than just survivors of a war that most people preferred to forget. The decision was not made with conscious deliberation, but arose from some deep place in Marcus's soul, where duty and loyalty still lived despite all the medication and therapy that had tried to bury them. He would move to Riverside, would take over Roberto's unfinished mission, would try to create the kind of place where veterans like himself could find their way back to the land of the living. It would not be easy, would require resources and skills he was not sure he possessed, but it would be a mission with meaning, a chance to serve again in a way that honored both the living and the dead. As the afternoon light began to fade, Marcus and Diesel climbed back up to the main floor of the fire station, The building felt different now, not abandoned but waiting, as if it had been holding its breath for someone to recognize its potential and give it purpose again. He walked through the empty bay one more time, imagining it filled with people who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds, who could see past the surface damage to the strength that still lived underneath. The drive back to Portland took place largely in darkness, the highway cutting through rural Oregon countryside that was visible only as the occasional cluster of lights marking another small town. Marcus drove in contemplative silence while Diesel slept in the passenger seat, both of them exhausted by the emotional weight of the day's discoveries. But underneath the exhaustion was something that Marcus had not felt in 2 years, a sense of forward momentum, of moving towards something instead of simply away from everything else. The apartment felt even more cramped and depressing after the vast spaces of the fire station, but Marcus no longer saw it as a prison but as a temporary way station on the journey to something better. He began making lists that night, sitting at his small kitchen table with a legal pad and pen, planning the logistics of a major life change. He would need to transfer his medical care to California, would need to find new doctors and therapists who understood military trauma. He would need to arrange for utility service to the fire station, would need to hire contractors to complete the renovation work that Roberto had started. Most importantly, he would need to research the legal and practical requirements for operating some kind of veteran service organization. He had no experience with non-profit management, no background in psychology or social work, no clear idea of how to transform Roberto's dream into reality. But he had learned in the military that complex missions began with simple steps, that even the most ambitious objectives could be achieved through careful planning and persistent execution. The medication bottles on his kitchen counter looked different that night, less like symbols of defeat and more like tools that would help him stay functional while he built something meaningful. He would always carry the wounds of his military service, would probably always need help managing the psychological aftermath of combat. But those wounds did not have to define him, did not have to limit what he could accomplish or how he could serve others who were fighting similar battles.
As he prepared for bed, Marcus felt something that had been absent from his life for too long: excitement about the future. Tomorrow he would begin the process of untangling himself from his current life and preparing for a new chapter that promised challenge, purpose, and the possibility of redemption. He was no longer just a broken veteran trying to survive in a world that had no use for his skills. He was a Marine who had been given a new mission, and he intended to execute that mission with the same dedication and commitment that had once made him a leader of men in the mountains of Afghanistan. Diesel seemed to sense the change in his human's mood, settling beside the bed with a contented sigh that Marcus had not heard in months. They had both been given a second chance, an opportunity to serve again in a way that might help heal not just their own wounds, but the wounds of others who had sacrificed everything for their country. It was a mission worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment, worthy of Bobby Martinez's memory and Roberto Martinez's dreams, worthy of the oath they had both taken to serve something larger than themselves. The moving truck disappeared down the dusty road in a cloud of exhaust and regret, leaving Marcus standing alone in the cavernous bay of Fire Station Number 7, with nothing but 2 duffel bags, a Coleman camping chair, and Diesel panting beside him in the California heat. The silence that followed was different from the oppressive quiet of his Portland apartment. This silence held possibility, stretched wide and deep like an empty canvas waiting for the first brushstroke. 3 weeks had passed since his decision to relocate, 3 weeks of bureaucratic phone calls, medical record transfers, and the strange melancholy of dismantling a life that had never quite fit anyway. The apartment lease had been broken with a penalty fee that stung his already tight budget, but the relief of walking away from those suffocating walls had been worth every dollar. His few possessions looked even more meager spread across the vast concrete floor of the fire station, a reminder of how little he had accumulated during 2 years of merely existing rather than living. Marcus set up the camping chair in the center of the bay and sat down to survey his new kingdom. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of golden light across the oil-stained floor. Diesel immediately began his own reconnaissance mission, trotting from corner to corner with his nose working overtime, cataloging every scent left behind by the building's previous inhabitants, both human and animal. His tail was actually moving, not quite a wag but a definite sign of engagement with his environment. The first night passed in restless discomfort on an air mattress that had seen better deployments, with only the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional settling groan of the old building for company. Marcus had grown accustomed to the urban symphony of Portland, the constant background noise that had been both torment and comfort. Here in Riverside, the quiet pressed against his eardrums with an intensity that made sleep elusive. Every small sound became amplified. Every creak of timber or rustle of wind through the gaps around the bay doors sent his nervous system into brief spikes of alertness. Diesel seemed to suffer no such adjustment difficulties, claiming a spot near the main entrance where he could monitor both the interior and exterior approaches to their new territory. The dog's military training never truly left him, even in retirement, and Marcus found comfort in knowing that at least one of them was maintaining proper security protocols. They were a two-man unit again, responsible for each other's welfare in an environment that was still largely unknown and potentially hostile. Morning brought the first of many practical challenges that Marcus had not fully anticipated during his romantic planning sessions back in Portland. The building's water had been turned off for years, and restoring service required inspections, permits, and the replacement of several corroded sections of pipe that had frozen and burst during previous winters. The electrical system was decades out of code, a maze of jury-rigged connections and overloaded circuits that would need complete replacement before he could safely operate anything more demanding than a few light bulbs. The list of necessary repairs grew longer with each day of exploration. The roof leaked in at least 3 places, evidenced by water stains on the ceiling and the musty smell of mold in the upstairs sleeping quarters. Several windows had cracked seals that allowed moisture and insects to infiltrate the building. The heating system consisted of a massive furnace in the basement that looked like it had been designed to warm an aircraft hangar, which was probably not far from the truth given the building's size and age. Marcus attacked these problems with the methodical approach he had learned in the military, breaking large objectives into smaller manageable tasks and prioritizing based on immediate need versus long-term improvement. Water and basic electricity came first, followed by weather sealing and pest control. The heating system could wait until autumn, as could many of the cosmetic improvements that would eventually be necessary to make the space suitable for hosting other veterans. The town of Riverside revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Marcus made daily trips to the hardware store, the building supply yard, and the small grocery that served as the community's primary source of food and gossip. The locals were friendly but cautious, unsure what to make of this newcomer who had purchased the abandoned fire station and seemed intent on living there alone except for his intimidating German shepherd. At Rodriguez Hardware, a family-owned establishment that had been serving the community for 3 generations, Marcus encountered his first real conversation with a local resident. Elena Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with calloused hands and sharp eyes, helped him select the plumbing supplies needed to restore water service to the station. She asked direct questions about his plans for the building, her tone suggesting that she had a vested interest in ensuring her community was not about to be disrupted by some eccentric outsider with more money than sense. Marcus found himself explaining Roberto Martinez's original vision, his own military background, and his hope of eventually creating some kind of retreat or support center for veterans struggling with their transition to civilian life. Elena listened without comment, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts about this proposal. Only when he mentioned Bobby Martinez's name did her demeanor shift, her features softening with what might have been recognition or sympathy. She had known the Martinez family, it turned out. Roberto had purchased supplies from Rodriguez Hardware during his renovation attempts, had spoken often about his plans for the fire station and his desire to honor his son's memory through service to other veterans. Elena had watched the older man's enthusiasm gradually fade as his health declined and his resources dwindled, had seen him struggle with the scope of the project he had undertaken without adequate help or funding. The conversation ended with Elena providing Marcus with the names and phone numbers of several local contractors who had worked with Roberto, men who understood the building's quirks and challenges, and who might be willing to continue the work at reasonable rates. She also mentioned the existence of a small veterans organization in town, an informal group that met monthly at the American Legion Hall to share stories and provide mutual support. It was not much, she admitted, but it was a place where Marcus might find both understanding and assistance for his ambitious plans. The Riverside Veterans Association turned out to be exactly what Elena had described, a loose confederation of older men who had served in various conflicts stretching back to Vietnam. They met on the second Thursday of each month in a cramped room behind the Legion's main bar, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee while discussing everything from VA medical appointments to grandchildren's graduation ceremonies. Marcus attended his first meeting 6 weeks after moving to town, drawn by curiosity and a desperate need for human contact with people who might understand his experience. The group's de facto leader was a man named Frank Gutierrez, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, who walked with a pronounced limp courtesy of a North Vietnamese mortar round that had found his patrol near Da Nang in 1968. Frank had worked for the phone company after his discharge, had raised 4 children with his wife Maria, and had spent the last decade serving as an informal counselor and advocate for younger veterans navigating the increasingly complex bureaucracy of military benefits and medical care. Frank welcomed Marcus with the gruff warmth that seemed to be his default mode of interaction, introducing him around the room and making it clear that membership in their informal brotherhood required nothing more than honorable service and a willingness to show up when possible. The other members ranged in age from their 50s to their 80s, representing deployments from Southeast Asia to Iraq and Afghanistan. What they shared was not specific experiences but rather the common challenge of building meaningful lives after their military service ended. During that first meeting, Marcus learned about the informal network of mutual support that existed among Riverside's veteran community. When someone needed help with a home repair project, a ride to a medical appointment, or just someone to talk to during a difficult period, word would spread through coffee shops and hardware stores until the necessary assistance materialized. It was not organized or official, but it was effective in the way that small-town institutions often were. Frank mentioned that he had known Roberto Martinez, had tried to provide encouragement and practical advice during the older man's attempts to renovate the fire station. Roberto had attended several meetings, had presented his vision for a veteran retreat center, and had asked for volunteers to help with construction and planning. The response had been enthusiastic but ultimately insufficient, as most of the group's members were dealing with their own health issues and family obligations that limited their ability to contribute significant time or labor. The conversation turned to Marcus's current situation and his plans for continuing Roberto's work. Several members offered specific assistance, from electrical work to carpentry to the arcane knowledge of local building codes and permit procedures. Others shared stories of their own struggles with post-military adjustment, creating an atmosphere of understanding that Marcus had not experienced since leaving the service. These were men who knew what it meant to wake up from nightmares, to struggle with anger and depression, to feel disconnected from a civilian world that seemed increasingly alien and incomprehensible. As autumn settled over the Central Valley, Marcus began to establish something resembling a routine within the vast spaces of the fire station. His days started before dawn with a long walk around the property perimeter, Diesel trotting beside him as they both emerged from the fog of sleep into the crisp morning air. The dog had thrived in their new environment, his coat regaining its luster and his energy returning to levels that Marcus had not seen since their deployment days. Diesel had claimed the entire 3 acres as his territory, patrolling the fence line and investigating any changes or intrusions with the thoroughness of a professional security specialist. The physical work of renovation provided Marcus with the kind of structured activity that had been missing from his life since his discharge. Each completed project, no matter how small, represented tangible progress toward a larger goal. The restoration of water service had been followed by the replacement of the most dangerous electrical circuits, then the repair of the roof leaks that had threatened to cause serious structural damage during the next rainy season. The work was hard and often frustrating, but it provided the satisfaction of using his hands to build something rather than simply surviving from one day to the next. His evenings were spent in the upstairs common room, which he had converted into a combination living space and office. A card table served as both dining area and desk, while a military surplus cot provided sleeping quarters that were more comfortable than his original air mattress but still Spartan by civilian standards. He had installed a small television that received 3 channels on good days, but he rarely watched it, preferring to spend his time reading about non-profit management, veteran services, and the practical aspects of operating a residential facility. The research revealed the daunting complexity of turning Roberto's dream into reality. State and federal regulations governing residential treatment facilities filled hundreds of pages with requirements for staffing, safety systems, medical oversight, and insurance coverage. The financial resources needed to meet these requirements were far beyond anything that Marcus could access through his military disability payments and the modest trust fund that Roberto had established for basic maintenance. However, his research also uncovered a network of organizations, foundations, and government programs that existed specifically to support veteran-focused initiatives. Grant opportunities ranged from small community-based projects to major federal funding streams designed to address the growing crisis of veteran suicide and homelessness. The application processes were complex and competitive, but they represented the only realistic path towards securing the resources necessary to make Roberto's vision operational. Marcus began drafting his first grant application on a cold October evening, sitting at his card table with Diesel curled up nearby and the sound of wind rattling the old windows. The process forced him to articulate not just what he wanted to accomplish but why it mattered, not just to him personally but to the broader community of veterans who were struggling with issues similar to his own. Writing about his own experiences with PTSD, depression, and social isolation was painful but cathartic, transforming private struggles into public testimony about the ongoing cost of military service. The application required detailed budgets, architectural plans, staffing proposals, and documentation of community support. Marcus found himself learning about construction costs, insurance requirements, and the regulatory landscape governing residential facilities in California. It was a crash course in non-profit management delivered through late-night internet research and phone calls with program officers who seemed genuinely interested in his project, but who also made clear the competitive nature of the funding process.
During this period of intense preparation, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in his own mental and emotional state. The constant focus on future goals and concrete objectives seemed to provide a buffer against the depression and anxiety that had dominated his life in Portland. He was still taking his medications, still dealing with occasional panic attacks and sleep disturbances, but these symptoms felt more manageable when they were occurring within the context of meaningful work rather than aimless survival. Diesel's improvement was even more dramatic. The dog had regained not just his physical vitality, but something approaching joy in his daily activities. He had established relationships with several of the contractors who worked on the building, greeting familiar vehicles with tail wags and accepting treats from workers who appreciated his professional demeanor.
His protective instincts remained sharp, but they were now focused on legitimate security concerns rather than the hypervigilance that had characterized his urban existence. The first real test of their new life came in early November, when Marcus submitted his initial grant application to a foundation that specialized in veteran mental health initiatives. The proposal requested $50,000 to complete the basic renovations necessary to make the fire station habitable for small groups, along with funding for initial program development and staff training. It was a modest request compared to the multi-million-dollar proposals that major organizations submitted, but it represented more money than Marcus had ever handled and the difference between success and failure for his emerging project. The waiting period that followed submission was excruciating, filled with second-guessing and anxiety about details that could no longer be changed. Marcus threw himself into physical work, tackling the renovation of the upstairs sleeping quarters that would eventually house program participants. The rooms were small and austere, designed for firefighters who needed nothing more than a clean bed and basic privacy during their shifts. Each room required new wiring, fresh paint and repairs to windows and doors that had suffered from years of neglect. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the men and women who might eventually occupy these spaces, veterans who were experiencing the same struggles with transition and identity that had brought him to this point. He tried to imagine what kind of environment would feel safe and welcoming to people carrying invisible wounds, what balance of structure and freedom would provide the stability needed for healing, without feeling like another form of institutional control. The grant application had required him to research evidence-based approaches to veteran mental health treatment, and he had been surprised by the variety of programs and philosophies that existed within the field. Some focused on traditional therapy and medication management, while others emphasized outdoor activities, creative arts, or peer support groups. The most successful programs seemed to combine multiple approaches while allowing for individual differences in what worked for each participant. Marcus's own experience suggested that physical work, clear objectives, and a sense of contributing to something larger than himself were crucial elements in his recovery process. The fire station project had provided all of these components, but he was aware that what worked for him might not work for everyone. The challenge would be creating a program flexible enough to meet diverse needs while maintaining the focus and intensity that seemed necessary for genuine transformation. Winter arrived early that year, bringing a series of storms that tested both the building's weatherproofing and Marcus's resolve to see the project through to completion. Rain found its way through repairs that had seemed adequate during dry weather, creating new leaks and threatening the electrical systems that had been so painstakingly installed. The heating system, which had been functioning adequately during mild autumn weather, proved inadequate for the brutal cold that settled over the Central Valley like a punishment from an angry god. Marcus and Diesel huddled around a series of space heaters that pushed the building's electrical system to its limits, creating fire hazards that would have horrified any safety inspector. The dog seemed to enjoy the weather, his thick coat providing natural insulation that his human companion lacked. During the worst storms, they would retreat to the basement, where the concrete walls provided better insulation, and the proximity to the ground offered some protection from the wind that howled through every gap in the building's aging envelope. It was during one of these basement retreats, while Marcus was sorting through more of Roberto's boxes and trying to stay warm, that he made a discovery that would fundamentally change his understanding of both the building and the project he had inherited. Hidden behind a stack of building supplies in the farthest corner of the basement was a metal filing cabinet that had been overlooked during his initial exploration of the space. The cabinet was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom of the top drawer in the way that people hide spare keys when security is less important than remembering where they put something. The files inside were meticulously organized, covering Roberto's research into the fire station's history, his communications with various contractors and suppliers, and his detailed plans for the renovation project. But mixed among these expected documents were materials that seemed to belong to a different kind of investigation entirely. There were newspaper clippings about suspicious deaths, copies of police reports, and handwritten notes that suggested Roberto had been looking into something far more complex than a simple building renovation. The first set of materials dealt with the history of Fire Station Number 7 itself, but not the official history that appeared in city records and newspaper archives. Roberto had compiled evidence of unusual events that had occurred during the station's operational years, incidents that had been reported but never fully investigated or explained. There were reports of firefighters becoming ill after responding to certain calls, equipment failures that occurred under suspicious circumstances, and patterns of personnel transfers that seemed designed to prevent anyone from staying at the station long enough to notice ongoing problems. One file contained copies of medical records for firefighters who had worked at Station 7 during the 1980s and 1990s, records that Roberto had somehow obtained through methods that were not explained in his notes. The records showed elevated rates of respiratory illness, neurological problems, and certain types of cancer among men who had served at this particular station. The rates were significantly higher than those found among firefighters at other stations in the region, suggesting exposure to some kind of environmental hazard that was specific to this location. Marcus read through these materials with growing unease, trying to understand how Roberto had obtained access to confidential medical information and what he had intended to do with his findings. The handwritten notes suggested that Roberto believed the health problems were connected to specific fires that Station 7 had responded to during those decades, fires at industrial facilities that had involved the burning of hazardous materials. The notes mentioned cover-ups, pressure from city officials to avoid certain types of investigations, and the systematic destruction of records that might have documented the true scope of the problem. Another file dealt with more recent events, incidents that had occurred during the years after Station 7 was officially closed. Roberto had documented a series of unexplained activities around the building, including late-night visits by vehicles with government license plates, the installation and removal of monitoring equipment, and what appeared to be ongoing soil and water testing by unidentified personnel. His notes suggested that he had been conducting his own surveillance of these activities, watching from concealed positions and photographing vehicles and personnel when possible. The photographs were grainy and poorly lit, taken from a distance with equipment that was clearly inadequate for the task, but they showed people in hazmat suits taking samples from various locations around the fire station property. Other photos showed trucks removing soil from areas near the building's foundation and the installation of monitoring wells that were subsequently hidden from casual observation. The dates on the photographs ranged from just a few months before Roberto's death to several years earlier, suggesting that this activity had been ongoing throughout his ownership of the property. As Marcus worked his way through the files, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Roberto had not simply purchased an abandoned fire station as the site for a veteran retreat center. He had unknowingly acquired a piece of property that was the focus of an ongoing environmental cleanup operation, possibly related to decades of improper disposal of hazardous materials or exposure to toxic substances during the building's operational years. The secrecy surrounding these activities suggested that someone with significant resources and authority was working to contain information about whatever had happened here. The final file in the cabinet contained Roberto's attempt to piece together the larger conspiracy that he believed was operating around the fire station. His notes connected various incidents and individuals, creating a web of relationships that stretched from local government officials to state environmental agencies to federal departments that he could not clearly identify. At the center of this web was a corporation called Advanced Environmental Solutions, which appeared to be the contractor responsible for the ongoing cleanup and monitoring activities. Roberto's research into Advanced Environmental Solutions had uncovered a disturbing pattern of involvement in similar cleanup operations at sites across California and several other western states. The company specialized in what it called sensitive environmental remediation, which seemed to involve the cleanup of contaminated sites where public knowledge of the contamination might create legal or political problems for the parties responsible. Their clients included major industrial corporations, government agencies, and military installations that needed environmental problems resolved quietly and completely. The notes suggested that Roberto had attempted to contact Advanced Environmental Solutions directly, seeking information about their activities on his property and their plans for future work. The company had refused to provide any details, citing client confidentiality and ongoing legal proceedings that prevented them from discussing their work with unauthorized parties. They had, however, made it clear that Roberto's presence on the property was unwelcome and that his renovation activities might interfere with their ongoing operations. Marcus sat in the cold basement, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that he was completely unprepared to understand or confront, feeling the weight of Roberto's unfinished investigation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The veteran retreat center that had seemed like such a noble and achievable goal suddenly felt naive and dangerous, a dream that had been built on a foundation of hidden contamination and official deception. The building that had promised sanctuary now felt like a trap, and the isolation that had seemed like peace now felt like vulnerability. Outside, the winter storm continued its assault on the aging structure, and Marcus could hear Diesel moving around upstairs, probably investigating some new scent or sound that his sensitive nose had detected. The dog's presence was reassuring, but it also reminded Marcus of how much responsibility he now carried. It was not just his own life that would be affected by whatever decision he made about Roberto's discoveries. Diesel depended on him completely, trusted him to keep them both safe, and to make choices that honored the bond they had forged in combat. The smart thing to do would be to walk away, to sell the property back to whoever wanted it, and return to the relative safety of urban anonymity. The VA disability system would provide enough support to keep him housed and fed, even if it meant returning to the kind of marginal existence he had known in Portland. Roberto's dream of helping other veterans was admirable, but it was not worth risking his life or Diesel's safety to pursue a goal that might be impossible to achieve, given the hidden complications surrounding the property. But as Marcus sat in the basement reading Roberto's files, he found himself thinking about Bobby Martinez, the young Marine who had died in a convoy outside Marja, and whose death had started the chain of events that led to this moment. Bobby had not chosen to walk away when things got dangerous. He had stayed at his post, had done his job until an improvised explosive device ended his young life and sent ripples of grief and determination through the lives of everyone who had known him. His father Roberto had channeled that grief into a mission of service, and now that mission was being threatened by forces that preferred secrecy to justice. Marcus understood, with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute decision, that this was no longer just about creating a veteran retreat center or honoring Roberto's memory. This was about the same thing that had motivated him during his military service, the principle that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were poor and the enemy was more powerful than you were. The people who had contaminated this property and then covered up their actions were counting on intimidation and bureaucratic complexity to protect them from accountability. They had not counted on a Marine who had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones you could not see. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of something that had already been determined by forces larger than his own comfort or safety. He would stay. He would continue Roberto's work, both the visible mission of helping veterans and the hidden investigation into whatever had happened at Fire Station Number 7. He would learn whatever skills were necessary to fight this battle, would find whatever allies existed, and would pursue the truth regardless of where it led or what it cost him personally. Diesel appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his silhouette backlit by the pale light from the main floor. The dog's posture suggested alertness rather than alarm, but Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his partner's assessment of their tactical situation. Something was happening upstairs, something that required attention but not immediate action. Marcus gathered the files he had been reading and climbed the stairs, his mind already shifting from shock and uncertainty to the focused calm that had served him well in combat. Through the windows of the main bay, he could see a vehicle approaching the fire station, its headlights cutting through the darkness and rain. The vehicle was moving slowly, deliberately, as if the driver was unfamiliar with the road or uncertain about their destination.
Marcus killed the interior lights and moved to a position where he could observe without being seen, Diesel taking up a similar position on the opposite side of the bay. They had done this dance before, in places where unknown vehicles arriving in darkness usually meant trouble. The black sedan moved through the storm like a predator testing unfamiliar territory, its engine barely audible above the wind and rain hammering against the fire station's windows. Marcus crouched beside the bay door, Roberto's files clutched in his left hand, while his right instinctively reached for a sidearm that was no longer there. Old habits died hard, especially when shaped by 3 tours in hostile territory, where unidentified vehicles arriving after dark usually brought death rather than good news. Diesel had positioned himself on the opposite side of the bay, his body low and tense, amber eyes tracking the approaching headlights with the focused intensity of a weapon system acquiring its target. The dog's military training had never truly left him either, and he recognized the same tactical patterns that had kept them alive in Afghanistan. Unknown contacts approaching their position under cover of darkness and weather required immediate assessment and preparation for multiple response scenarios. The sedan came to a stop just outside the chain-link fence, its headlights cutting through the rain to illuminate the fire station's red brick facade. Marcus could make out 2 figures in the front seats, but the distance and weather conditions made positive identification impossible. The vehicle sat motionless for several minutes, its occupants apparently conducting their own surveillance of the building and surrounding area. They were professionals, Marcus realized, taking time to assess the situation before committing to direct contact. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged, hunched against the storm and moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain in poor visibility. The person was wearing dark clothing and moved toward the main gate with purpose, suggesting this was not a random visit or case of mistaken directions. Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate as his nervous system shifted into the hyper-alert state that had once been essential for survival, but now felt like a curse he could not escape. A beam of light appeared as the figure produced a flashlight and began examining the gate and fence line. The light played across the no trespassing signs, the gaps in the fence that local kids had cut for access, and the tire tracks that Marcus's Honda had left in the muddy ground during his daily trips to town. Someone was conducting a detailed reconnaissance of his position, gathering information about his security measures and daily patterns with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation. The figure spent 10 minutes walking the perimeter of the property, their flashlight beam methodically cataloging every detail of the fence, the building's exterior, and the approaches to the main entrance. Marcus watched through night vision binoculars that he had acquired during his own military service, equipment that gave him a tactical advantage over visitors who assumed they were operating unobserved. The person examining his property was a woman, middle-aged and professional in her movements, wearing what appeared to be expensive clothing despite the harsh weather conditions. When she returned to the sedan, Marcus could hear the faint murmur of radio communication, though the words were lost in the storm's noise. The conversation lasted several minutes, suggesting that the woman was reporting to someone else, possibly coordinating with additional personnel who were not yet visible. Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical decision-making settling on his shoulders as he tried to determine whether this was a reconnaissance mission, a prelude to direct action, or something else entirely. The second figure emerged from the passenger side of the sedan, this one moving with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable with potentially hostile environments. Male, tall, wearing what looked like tactical clothing rather than the business attire of his companion.
He carried himself like military or law enforcement, someone accustomed to operating in situations where violence was always a possibility. The two figures met at the gate and engaged in brief conversation before the man began working on the lock mechanism with tools that he produced from his jacket. Marcus made his decision with the cold clarity that combat had taught him. He was not going to wait passively while unknown personnel breached his perimeter and approached his position. If they wanted to talk, they could announce themselves and request permission to enter like civilized people. If they were conducting some kind of covert operation, then they had already declared themselves hostile and he would respond accordingly. He moved through the fire station with the silent efficiency of a hunter, Diesel following close behind in the patrol formation they had perfected during countless missions in Afghanistan. The building's layout provided multiple defensive positions and escape routes, advantages that Marcus had unconsciously catalogued during his months of residence. Roberto's hidden investigation files went into a waterproof bag that he slung across his shoulder, ensuring that the evidence would survive whatever happened next. The main electrical panel was located in the basement, and Marcus killed all power to the building with a single switch, plunging the fire station into complete darkness. To observers outside, it would appear that he had simply gone to sleep or was no longer present, encouraging them to approach more boldly and reveal their true intentions. In reality, the darkness gave him a significant tactical advantage, as he knew every inch of the building's interior and could move through it without light, while any intruders would be operating in unfamiliar territory. He positioned himself at a second-floor window that provided overwatch of the main entrance, Roberto's evidence bag secured beside him and his cell phone ready to call for assistance if the situation escalated beyond his ability to handle alone. The phone's signal was weak but functional, though he doubted that local law enforcement would arrive quickly enough to matter if this encounter turned violent. Rural response times were measured in tens of minutes, not the seconds that might determine the outcome of a close-quarters engagement. The man at the gate had successfully bypassed the lock and was now opening the chain-link barrier to allow vehicular access to the property. The sedan moved forward slowly, its headlights sweeping across the fire station's facade as the driver looked for signs of occupancy or activity. The vehicle stopped directly in front of the main bay doors, positioning itself to block the most obvious escape route while providing cover for its occupants during whatever operation they intended to conduct. Both figures emerged from the sedan and approached the building with weapons drawn, though Marcus could not determine what type of firearms they were carrying. Their movement patterns suggested extensive training in building clearance and close-quarters combat, the kind of skills taught to military special operations personnel and federal law enforcement agents. These were not local thugs or private security contractors, but professionals operating with government authority or corporate resources that provided access to advanced training and equipment. The woman took position beside the main entrance, while the man moved to the side door that Marcus used for daily access to the building. They were preparing to execute a coordinated breach, probably assuming that the building's occupant was either absent or asleep and unprepared for their arrival. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that their assumptions were incorrect and that he held tactical advantages they had not anticipated. The man at the side door produced what appeared to be electronic lock-picking equipment, devices that could bypass most civilian security systems in seconds. Marcus had installed only basic locks on the fire station's entrances, relying more on the building's isolation and his own vigilance for security than on expensive hardware that determined intruders could defeat anyway. The lock yielded quickly, and Marcus heard the faint creak of hinges as the door opened onto the building's dark interior. Both intruders entered the building simultaneously, their movements coordinated and professional despite the complete darkness that now filled the fire station's interior spaces. Marcus could track their progress by sound as they moved through the main bay toward the staircase that led to the upper floors where they presumably expected to find him sleeping. They were using night vision equipment, he realized, as their movement was too confident and direct for people operating in natural darkness. The tactical situation was clear and immediate. Two armed intruders had breached his residence using professional equipment and techniques, suggesting either law enforcement personnel operating without proper warrants or private operators working for the corporate interests that Roberto had been investigating. In either case, Marcus was legally justified in defending his property and person using whatever force proved necessary, though he preferred to avoid violence if alternative solutions remained available. He activated the small tactical flashlight he had positioned beside his observation post, directing its beam toward the intruder's approximate position while remaining concealed behind the window frame. The sudden light would temporarily compromise their night vision advantage and force them to respond to his initiative rather than continuing their planned operation on their own terms. It was a psychological gambit as much as a tactical one, demonstrating that they were no longer operating unobserved. The response was immediate and telling. Both figures took defensive positions and attempted to locate the source of the light, their movements revealing extensive tactical training, but also confirming that they had not expected resistance from the building's occupant. One of them shouted a command that was clearly intended to establish authority and control over the situation, though the words were lost in the building's echoing acoustics and the continuing noise of the storm outside. Marcus had heard enough authority in his military career to recognize the real thing, and these people did not possess it. Their commands carried the artificial aggression of private contractors or corporate security personnel trying to intimidate civilian targets through bluff and intimidation. Real federal agents would have announced their identity and authority immediately, would have demanded compliance with specific legal statutes, would have behaved like law enforcement officers rather than mercenaries operating in legal gray areas. He triggered the fire station's emergency lighting system, a battery-powered network that illuminated the main bay and stairwells with harsh white light designed to aid evacuation during structural fires. The sudden illumination revealed both intruders clearly for the first time, confirming Marcus's assessment of their professional capabilities, while also exposing their tactical positions to his observation and potential engagement. The psychological effect was immediate and significant, shifting the balance of initiative from the intruders to the building's defender. The woman was indeed middle-aged and professionally dressed despite the weather conditions, though she now held a compact submachine gun with the competence of someone extensively trained in its use. The man was younger and more obviously equipped for tactical operations, wearing body armor and carrying what appeared to be a military pattern assault rifle. Both were Caucasian, well-groomed and expensive in their appearance and equipment, suggesting corporate rather than government affiliation. Marcus keyed his cell phone and activated its speaker function, ensuring that his voice would be clearly audible throughout the building's interior spaces. His words were calm and professional, carrying the authority of someone completely comfortable with armed confrontation and confident in his legal and tactical position. He identified himself as the property owner, stated that the intruders were trespassing on private property, and demanded that they identify themselves and their authority for being present. The response confirmed his worst suspicions about their intentions and affiliations. The woman announced that they were conducting a lawful investigation into potential environmental violations, and that Marcus was required to cooperate with their inquiries or face federal criminal charges. She claimed to represent Advanced Environmental Solutions, the same corporation that Roberto's files had identified as the primary contractor for the ongoing cleanup and monitoring activities around the fire station property. Marcus felt cold certainty settle in his stomach as the final pieces of Roberto's investigation clicked into place. These were not government agents but corporate personnel operating under the fiction of environmental authority, using the complexity of federal regulations and the average citizen's ignorance of their rights to conduct illegal searches and intimidate potential witnesses. Roberto had been investigating their activities, had discovered evidence of their cover-up operations, and had probably been killed to prevent him from exposing their activities to legitimate authorities. The tactical situation required immediate escalation to real law enforcement, people with genuine authority and legal obligations to investigate crimes rather than cover them up. Marcus activated the emergency speed dial function on his phone, connecting directly to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department dispatch center. His report was clear and urgent. Armed intruders had breached his residence, were claiming false authority, and represented an immediate threat to his safety and property. The dispatcher's response was professional and reassuring, confirming that deputy sheriffs were being dispatched to his location and requesting that he remain on the line, while avoiding direct confrontation with the intruders if possible. Marcus provided his military service record and security clearance information, establishing his credibility and the seriousness of the situation, while also ensuring that responding officers would understand they were dealing with someone capable of defending himself if necessary. The corporate personnel below had heard his radio communication and were now engaged in urgent conversation with someone via their own communication equipment. Marcus could not make out their words, but their body language suggested they were receiving instructions from supervisors who were not pleased with this development.
The arrival of legitimate law enforcement would complicate their mission significantly and potentially expose their activities to official scrutiny that they had been working to avoid. The man with the assault rifle was moving toward the staircase, apparently intending to ascend to Marcus's position and end this confrontation through direct action rather than negotiation. His movement was aggressive and purposeful, suggesting that he had received orders to secure the evidence that Roberto had compiled regardless of the legal consequences or potential collateral damage. Marcus recognized the moment when a situation shifted from tense confrontation to imminent violence, and he prepared to respond accordingly. Diesel had been silent throughout the standoff, but now he released a low growl that carried clearly through the building's interior spaces. The dog was positioned at the top of the staircase where he could observe both intruders while remaining concealed from their direct observation. His military training included force protection protocols, and he recognized the tactical indicators that suggested his human was about to come under direct attack. The growl was not a warning but a promise, the sound that enemy personnel had learned to fear during their deployment in Afghanistan. The woman shouted a command to her companion, apparently recognizing that the situation was deteriorating beyond their ability to control through intimidation and false authority. The man paused on the staircase, his weapon oriented toward Marcus's position but not yet directly threatening. For a moment the fire station was filled with tense silence, broken only by the storm outside and the distant sound of approaching sirens that suggested legitimate help was finally en route. Marcus made his final tactical assessment of the situation with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. These people represented a direct threat to his life and safety, had committed multiple felonies in their attempt to suppress evidence of corporate malfeasance, and would not hesitate to eliminate him if they believed it necessary to protect their operations. Roberto Martinez had probably died because he had uncovered the same evidence that now sat in a bag beside Marcus's position, and these same people were now prepared to kill again to maintain their secret. The first sheriff's cruiser came screaming down the access road with its emergency lights painting the storm in alternating red and blue flashes, its siren clearly audible despite the wind and rain. Marcus felt profound relief wash over him as he realized that he would not have to resolve this confrontation through violence, that legitimate authority was about to arrive and restore legal order to a situation that had spiraled far beyond acceptable bounds. The corporate personnel below were now trapped between an armed veteran who knew his rights and approaching law enforcement officers who would demand explanations for their presence and activities. The woman made a critical error in judgment, raising her weapon toward Marcus's position in what he could only interpret as an attempt to eliminate him before the sheriff's deputies entered the building. Her movement was smooth and professional, but Marcus had been watching for exactly this escalation and was prepared to respond with lethal force if necessary.
His own weapon appeared in his hands with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of military training, its laser sight painting a red dot on the woman's center mass as he acquired his target and prepared to engage. Diesel launched himself down the staircase with the explosive speed and devastating impact that had made him legendary among enemy forces in Afghanistan. The dog struck the armed man with the full weight of his body, driving him backward and sending his rifle clattering across the concrete floor. The impact was followed by the sound of human screaming as Diesel's combat training took over, his powerful jaws seeking the disabling bite that would end this threat to his human permanently and completely. The woman swung her weapon toward the dog, apparently intending to eliminate the animal before returning her attention to Marcus. It was a tactical mistake that demonstrated incomplete understanding of the combat partnership between soldier and military working dog, a relationship that had been forged in life and death situations and refined through constant training. Marcus's shot took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon flying across the bay to skitter under a piece of construction equipment where it would be irretrievable during the immediate tactical situation. Sheriff's deputies poured through both entrances to the building with weapons drawn and commands echoing off the walls, their arrival transforming the intimate violence of close combat into the organized confusion of law enforcement response to a shots-fired emergency. Marcus immediately complied with their commands, placing his weapon on the floor and assuming a position that demonstrated his willingness to cooperate with legitimate authority. His military identification and concealed carry permit were clearly visible, establishing his legal right to defend his property and person against armed intruders. The scene that the deputies found defied easy categorization or explanation. Two professional operatives equipped with military-grade weapons and tactical gear had been conducting an illegal search of a veteran's residence when confronted by the property owner and his military working dog. One intruder was suffering from severe bite wounds that would require immediate medical attention, while the other was bleeding from a gunshot wound that had disabled her weapon arm but was not life-threatening. Both were conscious and able to communicate, though neither was willing to explain their presence or authority for being on private property. The corporate identification that the intruders carried confirmed Marcus's assessment of their affiliation with advanced environmental solutions, though their weapons and tactics suggested capabilities far beyond those normally associated with environmental consulting firms. The senior deputy on scene, a veteran of both military service and law enforcement who understood the complexities of corporate security operations, separated the parties and began conducting preliminary interviews to establish the basic facts of the confrontation. Marcus presented Roberto's investigation files to the deputies as evidence of the broader conspiracy that had led to this confrontation, explaining his inheritance of the fire station property and his discovery of ongoing illegal activities by corporate personnel who claimed environmental cleanup authority. The files contained enough documentation to establish probable cause for a comprehensive investigation into advanced environmental solutions activities, including their potential involvement in Roberto Martinez's suspicious death and their ongoing intimidation of witnesses and property owners. The storm was beginning to clear as ambulances arrived to transport the wounded intruders to the county hospital for treatment, their emergency lights adding to the carnival atmosphere that had transformed Marcus's quiet retreat into a crime scene worthy of federal investigation. Media vehicles were already arriving despite the late hour and remote location, suggesting that word of the confrontation was spreading through law enforcement communication networks and attracting attention from journalists who specialized in corporate malfeasance stories. Dawn was breaking over the Central Valley as Marcus finally found himself alone again in the fire station, though the building now bore the scars of armed confrontation and would never again feel like the sanctuary he had hoped to create. Yellow police tape marked the areas where evidence had been collected, and chalk outlines showed where the intruders had fallen during their brief but violent encounter with legitimate resistance to their illegal activities. Diesel had been examined by a veterinarian and pronounced physically uninjured, though the dog's demeanor suggested that the night's violence had reawakened combat instincts that military retirement was supposed to have pacified. He remained close to Marcus throughout the post-incident interviews and evidence collection, his amber eyes tracking every law enforcement officer and emergency responder who entered their space. The bond between soldier and military working dog had been tested once again and had proven unbreakable under the extreme stress of life and death combat. The federal investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months of Marcus's life, transforming him from a struggling veteran seeking peace into a key witness in a case that ultimately exposed decades of illegal environmental dumping, corporate cover-ups, and the systematic intimidation of citizens who threatened to reveal inconvenient truths about industrial contamination. Advanced Environmental Solutions proved to be a front organization for a consortium of chemical companies that specialized in making environmental problems disappear through bribery, intimidation, and when necessary, violence. Roberto Martinez's death was officially reclassified as homicide after forensic examination revealed traces of exotic toxins that had been administered to simulate heart attack symptoms, an assassination technique that required resources and expertise far beyond the capabilities of ordinary criminals. His investigation files became the foundation for criminal charges against corporate executives, government officials, and private contractors who had participated in the conspiracy to conceal environmental crimes that stretched across multiple states and decades. The fire station property was eventually declared safe for habitation after extensive soil remediation and groundwater treatment, though the process required 2 years of intensive cleanup operations that were funded through court-ordered settlements with the corporations responsible for the original contamination. Marcus remained on the property throughout the cleanup process, serving as the community's watchdog and advocate, while also continuing his work on the veteran retreat center that Roberto had originally envisioned. The retreat center that eventually opened at Fire Station No. 7 was larger and more comprehensive than either Roberto or Marcus had originally imagined, funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and legal settlements that provided resources for a state-of-the-art facility designed specifically to address the needs of veterans struggling with combat trauma and civilian transition issues. The program that Marcus developed emphasized practical skills training, peer support, and meaningful work projects that gave participants a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Diesel became the facility's unofficial mascot and primary therapeutic asset, his calm presence and understanding demeanor providing comfort to veterans who were dealing with their own invisible wounds from military service. The dog had aged during their years in Riverside, but remained alert and engaged with the world around him, finding new purpose in helping other warriors discover that healing was possible even when the scars never fully disappeared. Marcus stood in the main bay of the fire station on a crisp autumn morning, watching as the latest group of program participants worked together to restore a vintage fire truck that would eventually become part of the facility's community outreach program. The truck had been donated by the city of Riverside as a gesture of support for the retreat center, and its restoration had become a symbol of the larger work of rebuilding lives that had been damaged by war and trauma. The work was hard and sometimes frustrating, requiring patience and skills that many of the participants had to learn through trial and error. But Marcus could see in their faces the same transformation that he had experienced during his own journey from broken veteran to purposeful guardian of his community. They were discovering that healing was not about forgetting the past or pretending that their wounds did not exist, but about finding new ways to serve others and create meaning from their experiences. Frank Gutierrez had become a regular volunteer at the facility, sharing his decades of experience with veteran advocacy and lending his mechanical skills to the various restoration and construction projects that kept the retreat center functioning. His presence provided a bridge between different generations of veterans, demonstrating that the challenges of military transition were universal even as the specific conflicts and technologies changed over time. Elena Rodriguez had been instrumental in helping the retreat center establish connections with the broader Riverside community, ensuring that the veterans who came for treatment and support were welcomed as neighbors rather than viewed as problems to be managed or avoided. Her hardware store had become an unofficial supply depot for the facility's ongoing projects, and her family had adopted several program graduates who needed stable housing and employment opportunities after completing their treatment. The legal victories against advanced environmental solutions and their co-conspirators had established important precedents for holding corporations accountable for environmental crimes and protecting communities from the kind of systematic deception that had characterized the conspiracy around Fire Station Number 7. Marcus had testified before congressional committees and environmental protection agencies, helping to strengthen regulations and enforcement mechanisms that would make similar cover-ups more difficult to sustain. But the most important victory had been personal, the transformation from isolated survivor to engaged advocate that had given Marcus a reason to continue living and serving others long after his military career had officially ended. The retreat center was not just a treatment facility but a community of warriors who understood each other's struggles and supported each other's efforts to build meaningful lives from the wreckage of war. As evening approached, Marcus walked the perimeter of the property with Diesel at his side, their daily patrol ritual that maintained both security and the comfortable routine that had structured their lives for years. The fence that surrounded the facility was no longer a barrier against intruders but a boundary that defined a space where healing was possible and hope could be rebuilt from the foundation of shared experience and mutual support. The fire station's communication tower still rose into the sky, though it now served as a radio relay point for the county's emergency services rather than the obsolete system it had once supported. The symbolism was not lost on Marcus, who understood that the most important transformations often involve finding new purposes for old structures rather than abandoning them entirely. He had not escaped his military identity or forgotten the battles that had shaped him, but had found ways to use those experiences in service of something larger and more lasting than his own survival. Roberto Martinez's dream had become reality through a process that neither he nor Marcus could have anticipated, requiring courage and sacrifice that exceeded anything either man had imagined when the journey began. The conspiracy that had threatened to bury that dream forever had instead become the catalyst for its complete fulfillment, proving that truth and justice could prevail even against powerful enemies who believed themselves beyond the reach of accountability. The retreat center that bore Roberto's name had served more than 200 veterans during its first 5 years of operation, providing treatment and support that had prevented dozens of suicides and helped countless families rebuild relationships that had been damaged by the invisible wounds of war. The facility's success had inspired similar programs across the country, creating a network of veteran-focused treatment centers that addressed the unique challenges faced by men and women transitioning from military to civilian life. Marcus had found his peace not through escape from his past but through engagement with a mission that honored both his military service and his commitment to helping others who were fighting similar battles. The fire station that had once housed emergency responders dedicated to protecting their community now served a similar function for a different kind of emergency, providing rapid response to veterans who were struggling with the life and death battles that took place inside their own minds. Diesel had lived to see the dream fulfilled, passing away peacefully in his sleep during the retreat center's 4th year of operation after a life of service that had spanned 2 careers and saved more lives than could ever be counted. His memory was honored with a bronze statue in the facility's memorial garden, where veterans could sit quietly and remember their own fallen comrades while drawing strength from the knowledge that their sacrifices had meaning beyond the immediate violence of war. The story of Fire Station Number 7 had become legend within the veteran community, proof that ordinary people could confront powerful enemies and prevail when they had courage, determination and the support of others who understood the stakes involved. Marcus had learned that healing was not a destination but a journey that required constant vigilance and commitment, and that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons but with the simple determination to keep serving others regardless of personal cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.